The wildflowers trembled in Eleanor Campbell's hands as she knelt beside the fresh grave, her black mourning dress pooling in the dusty Kansas soil like spilled ink. The sun beat down mercilessly on Ellsworth's small cemetery that July afternoon in 1872, and she could feel sweat trickling down her spine beneath her corset, mixing with tears she no longer bothered to hide. James had been gone 3 months now, taken by a fever that swept through town faster than a prairie fire, and she still could not quite believe that the man she had married at 19 would never again walk through their door, never again pull her into his arms and spin her around their modest kitchen. She pressed the roots of the purple coneflowers into the earth, her fingers working mechanically. James had always loved wildflowers, had picked them for her on their wedding day because they could not afford roses. The memory made her throat tighten, and she blinked rapidly, trying to focus on the task at hand. The cemetery was quiet except for the whisper of wind through the grass and the distant sound of cattle lowing from the stockyards that made Ellsworth prosperous. "Those will take nicely if you water them regular." Eleanor's head snapped up so quickly her bonnet slipped backward. A man stood a respectful distance away, hat in his hands, the afternoon sun casting his shadow long across the graves. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were an unusual shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, and they held a kindness that made her breath catch. "I apologize, madam," he said quickly, taking a step back. "I did not mean to startle you. I was visiting my mother's grave yonder and noticed you planting. I have some experience with flowers, is all." Eleanor sat back on her heels, studying him. He wore dusty trail clothes and boots that had seen better days, but he carried himself with quiet dignity. A gun belt hung at his hip, but his hands remained carefully visible, holding his battered hat. "Thank you," she managed, her voice hoarse from crying. "I appreciate the advice." He nodded, seemingly about to leave, but then hesitated. "Forgive me, but you look like you could use some water yourself. It is powerful hot today. I have a canteen on my horse." Eleanor realized her lips were cracked and dry, and she had been out here for over an hour without thinking to bring anything to drink. She nodded gratefully, and he walked to where a handsome bay gelding stood tied to the cemetery fence. He returned with a canteen and handed it to her carefully, their fingers not quite touching. The water was warm but tasted like salvation. She drank deeply, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, suddenly conscious of how she must look with her tear-streaked face and dirt-smudged dress. "I am Frank Morrison," he said softly. "I am sorry for your loss. Eleanor Campbell." She handed back the canteen. "My husband." 3 months ago. Something flickered in Frank's eyes, a recognition of grief that suggested he knew it intimately. "My mother passed 2 years back. The ache lessens, but it never quite leaves." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, and then Frank cleared his throat. "I should let you be. But truly, about those flowers, if you pack the soil firm around the roots and give them a good soaking tonight after the sun goes down, they will have a better chance. And maybe put some stones around them to keep the rabbits off." "You seem to know quite a bit about gardening for a cowboy," Eleanor said, and immediately flushed. "I apologize, I should not presume." But Frank smiled, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger. "No offense taken, madam. I am a cowboy, or was. Just finished a drive up from Texas. But my mother loved her garden something fierce, and she made sure I knew how to tend growing things before she would let me ride off to punch cattle." His expression grew distant. Said a man who could coax life from the earth was a man who understood what mattered. Eleanor found herself smiling despite her grief. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was that. Frank replaced his hat, tipping it to her. "I will leave you to your work, Mrs. Campbell. Again, my condolences." He walked back to his horse, and Eleanor watched him go, feeling oddly bereft. She turned back to the grave, finishing the planting with more care, pressing the soil firmly as Frank had suggested. As she worked, she found herself glancing toward where he knelt at another grave, his head bowed, lips moving in silent prayer or conversation with the dead. When Eleanor finally stood, her knees protesting, Frank was gone. She gathered her gardening tools into her basket and walked slowly back toward town, her shadow stretching long before her. Ellsworth bustled with evening activity, cowboys fresh off the trail spending their pay in saloons, women hurrying to finish shopping before supper, children playing in the dusty streets. Eleanor felt separate from it all, wrapped in her widow's weeds and grief like a cocoon. Her small house on the edge of town felt emptier than usual that night. She lit the lamp and moved through the familiar motions of making supper for one, eating without tasting, washing her single plate and cup. As the sun set, she remembered Frank's advice about watering the flowers. She filled a bucket from the well and walked back through the twilight to the cemetery. The flowers looked fragile in the fading light, and she watered them carefully, whispering to James as she had taken to doing. "I met someone today. He was kind. I think you would have liked him." Saying it aloud made her feel guilty, as though she was betraying James's memory by even noticing another man, but she pushed the feeling aside. She was 23 years old, and James had been dead 3 months. She was allowed to notice kindness. Over the next week, Eleanor fell into a new routine. Each evening, she would walk to the cemetery with her bucket and water the coneflowers. They seemed to be taking hold, their purple blooms brightening against the grave marker. And 3 times that week, she encountered Frank Morrison there as well. The first time seemed like coincidence. He was leaving as she arrived, and they exchanged polite greetings. The second time, he was tending his mother's grave, pulling weeds and straightening the small stones that marked its border. The third time, he had a flat of marigolds with him. "I thought she would like some color," he said, almost defensively. The fellow at the general store said these would do well in the heat. Eleanor knelt beside him unbidden, helping him plant the bright orange flowers. They worked in companionable silence for a while before Frank spoke again. "I have been in Ellsworth for 2 weeks now," he said quietly. "I should probably be moving on, but I have been lingering." "What keeps you here?" Eleanor asked, though she thought she might know the answer by the way he glanced at her. "I have been asking myself that same question." Frank sat back, wiping dirt from his hands. "I have saved enough from the cattle drive to buy some land, maybe start a small ranch. I have been looking around the area, seeing if there is anything suitable." "There is good land to be had north of town," Eleanor said. "My husband and I used to talk about buying property out that way, maybe raising horses." She swallowed hard. "That will not happen now, obviously." Frank was quiet for a moment. "What will you do, if you do not mind my asking?" "I have been taking in sewing," Eleanor said. "James left me the house free and clear, so I have a roof over my head. It is not much, but I can manage." She did not mention how lonely the nights were, how sometimes she woke from dreams where James was still alive and had to remember all over again that he was gone. "Would you like to walk back to town together?" Frank asked. "It is getting dark." Eleanor knew she should decline. Propriety demanded she maintain her mourning, avoid the company of men, especially men as attractive as Frank Morrison. But she found herself nodding, and they walked slowly through the deepening dusk, talking about small things. The weather, the cattle trade, the flowers they had planted. At her gate, Frank tipped his hat. "Good evening, Mrs. Campbell." "Good evening, Mr. Morrison, and thank you for the company." She watched him walk away into the darkness before going inside, and for the first time since James died, the house did not feel quite so empty. The pattern continued. Nearly every evening, Eleanor would find Frank at the cemetery, and they would tend their respective graves together before walking back to town. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from childhood memories to dreams for the future. Frank told her about growing up in Missouri, about learning to ride almost before he could walk, about the open range and star-filled nights on cattle drives. Eleanor shared her own stories of growing up in Ohio, of coming west with her parents as a girl, of meeting James at a church social, and knowing immediately that he was kind. "You must have loved him very much," Frank said one evening as they paused at a small creek that ran past the cemetery. "I did," Eleanor said honestly, "but we were so young when we married. Sometimes I wonder who we might have become if he had lived longer, if we would have grown together or apart." She looked at Frank. "Does that sound terrible?" "It sounds human," Frank said quietly. "My mother used to say that loving someone does not mean pretending they were perfect, or that the relationship was without questions. It means honoring what was real." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I like that." Frank reached out as though to touch her hand, then seemed to think better of it and pulled back. "I bought some land," he said abruptly. 200 acres north of town. There is a creek running through it, good grazing and a stand of cottonwoods that would be perfect for building a house." "That sounds wonderful," Eleanor said, meaning it. "When will you start building?" "Soon." Frank kicked at a rock, suddenly seeming younger and uncertain. "Mrs. Campbell, I know this is forward and I know you are still in mourning, but I would very much like to call on you properly. Not just chance meetings at the cemetery, but actual calling, with flowers and conversation on your porch and maybe Sunday dinners after church." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, but another part felt guilty, as though accepting would dishonor James's memory. She must have been silent too long because Frank's face fell. "I apologize," he said quickly. "That was inappropriate. Please forget I said anything." "No," Eleanor said, finding her voice. "No, do not apologize. I am just surprised, that is all, and confused. I do not know what is proper or right anymore." "Then let me make it simple," Frank said, and this time he did take her hand, his calloused fingers warm around hers. "I think you are remarkable, Eleanor Campbell. I think you are strong and kind and beautiful, and these past weeks getting to know you have been the happiest I have been in a long time. I am not asking you to forget your husband or to rush into anything. I am just asking if maybe someday you might let yourself be happy again, with me." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, then up at Frank's earnest face. She thought about the long, lonely nights ahead, about growing old alone in her empty house, about never again feeling the warmth of being loved. And then she thought about James, about the man he had been, about how he had always wanted her to be happy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, you may call on me properly." Frank's smile was like sunrise breaking. "Truly, truly, but we should take things slowly. I need time." "I have all the time in the world," Frank said. They walked back to town holding hands, and when they reached Eleanor's gate, Frank lifted her fingers to his lips and kissed them gently. "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night, Frank." She floated into the house, her heart lighter than it had been in months. But as she prepared for bed, guilt crept in. She looked at the tintype of James on her bedside table, at his serious young face frozen forever at 24. "I hope you understand," she whispered to the image. "I hope wherever you are, you want me to be happy." The tintype stared back, silent, and Eleanor blew out the lamp. True to his word, Frank began calling on Eleanor properly. He would arrive each Sunday afternoon, freshly bathed and wearing his best shirt, carrying wildflowers he had picked on his land. They would sit on her porch and talk while the town dozed in the heat, and Eleanor found herself laughing more, smiling more, living more. Frank was different from James in many ways. Where James had been quiet and cautious, Frank was open and adventurous. Where James had been content with their small life, Frank dreamed big, talking about building not just a house but a real ranch, about breeding horses, about creating something lasting. But like James, Frank was fundamentally kind, and that kindness drew Eleanor like a moth to flame. 6 weeks after Frank first asked to call on her, he invited Eleanor to see his land. She borrowed a horse from the livery, and they rode out together on a bright August morning, the prairie stretching endlessly around them, golden grass rippling in the wind like water. The land was beautiful. The creek Frank had mentioned ran clear and cold, shaded by massive cottonwoods that must have been growing for 50 years or more. Rolling hills provided natural windbreaks, and Eleanor could easily imagine horses grazing on the rich grass. "What do you think?" Frank asked anxiously as they sat beneath the cottonwoods, the horses cropping grass nearby. "I think it is perfect," Eleanor said honestly. "I can see why you chose it." Frank pulled a folded paper from his pocket, smoothing it out on his knee. It was a rough sketch of a house, clearly drawn by an amateur but detailed. "I have been planning," he said. "The house would go here, facing east to catch the morning sun. A barn there, corrals beyond, maybe a garden here where the creek would make irrigation easy." Eleanor studied the drawing, something warm unfurling in her chest. "It is well thought out." "I have been thinking about more than just the ranch," Frank said quietly. He set the drawing aside and took her hands. "Eleanor, I know we have only known each other a few months. I know you are still mourning your husband, and I do not want to rush you. But I also know what I feel, and I am not a man who believes in wasting time or hiding the truth." Eleanor's breath caught. "Frank, I am in love with you," he said simply. "I think I have been since that first day in the cemetery, when you looked up at me with tears on your face and still managed to be gracious to a stranger. I want to build this ranch with you. I want to plant gardens and raise horses and build a life together. I want to make you happy, Eleanor, if you will let me." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks, but they were not tears of grief. "I am in love with you too," she whispered. "I did not think I could feel this way again, and I felt so guilty at first, but Frank, when I am with you, I feel alive. I feel like myself again." Frank cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "Then marry me, not today or tomorrow, but when you are ready. Marry me and help me build this dream." "Yes," Eleanor said, and this time there was no hesitation, no guilt. "Yes, I will marry you." Frank kissed her then, gentle and sweet, and Eleanor kissed him back, letting herself feel joy without reservation. Above them, the cottonwood leaves rustled in the wind, and the creek sang its endless song, and the future spread out before them like the open prairie. They decided to wait until October to marry, giving Eleanor time to finish her mourning period and Frank time to build at least the basic structure of their house. Eleanor helped with the planning, riding out to the land several times a week, bringing lunch and staying to work alongside Frank as he cleared ground and hauled lumber. The work was hard but satisfying. Eleanor found she loved being outdoors, loved the physical labor, loved watching their dreams take shape in wood and stone. Frank hired 2 men from town to help with the heavy construction, and by mid-September, the house had walls and a roof. It was simple but solid, 3 rooms that would expand as they could afford it, with a covered porch facing the creek and windows positioned to catch the cross breeze. Eleanor sewed curtains and pieced together a quilt. She sold her house in town, using the money to buy furniture and supplies. The women of Ellsworth had been scandalized at first when word spread that the widow Campbell was remarrying so soon, but Eleanor found she did not care what they thought. She was happy, truly happy, and she refused to apologize for it. The night before the wedding, Eleanor visited James's grave one last time alone. The wildflowers had spread, creating a purple carpet around the marker. She knelt and laid her hand on the sun-warmed stone. "I will always love you," she said quietly. "You were my first love, and you will always be a part of who I am. But I am choosing to live, James. I am choosing to be happy. I hope you understand. I think you would like Frank. He is a good man like you were." The wind whispered through the grass, and Eleanor could almost imagine it was James giving his blessing. She stood, brushed off her skirt, and walked away without looking back. The wedding took place on a perfect October morning, cool and clear, with the smell of harvest in the air. They married at the small church in Ellsworth, with half the town in attendance despite the earlier scandals. Eleanor wore a simple dress of dove gray, no longer in full mourning but not quite ready for bright colors. Frank wore his best suit, his hair slicked back, his eyes shining as Eleanor walked down the aisle. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Frank kissed Eleanor with such tenderness that several women in the congregation sighed audibly. They held a small reception in the church hall, with cake and punch and dancing, and then they rode out to their ranch together as the sun began to set. The house looked beautiful in the golden light, smoke already rising from the chimney where Frank had laid a fire that morning. He helped Eleanor down from her horse and then, to her surprise, swept her up in his arms. "What are you doing?" she laughed. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," Frank said, grinning. "It is tradition." He carried her inside, setting her down gently in the main room. It was simply furnished but cozy, with the quilt Eleanor had made spread across their bed and the curtains she had sewn fluttering in the windows. Wildflowers filled a vase on the table, and candles cast a warm glow. "Welcome home, Mrs. Morrison," Frank said softly. "Welcome home, Mr. Morrison," Eleanor replied, and they came together in a kiss that deepened, grew urgent as they stumbled toward the bed and began their marriage in earnest. Later, lying in Frank's arms with moonlight streaming through the window, Eleanor felt peace settle over her like a benediction. This was right. This was home. The first year of their marriage brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Frank worked from dawn to dusk building up the ranch, breaking horses that he bought cheap and selling them trained for a profit. Eleanor kept the house, planted an enormous garden, and learned to handle horses herself, discovering she had a natural talent for it. Winter came hard that first year, with blizzards that buried the ranch in snow and temperatures that dropped so low the creek froze solid. Frank and Eleanor huddled close at night, talking and planning for spring. Eleanor taught Frank to read better, as his schooling had been limited, and he taught her to play the harmonica he had carried for years. In February, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She told Frank one evening after supper, simply and directly, "We are going to have a baby." Frank's face went through a dozen expressions in as many seconds: shock, joy, fear, wonder. Then he whooped, picked Eleanor up, and spun her around before immediately setting her down again, afraid he had hurt her. "I am not made of glass," Eleanor laughed, but she was crying too, happy tears. "When?" Frank asked, his hand going to her still flat belly. "Late summer, I think. August or September." Frank knelt and pressed his ear to her stomach as though he could hear the baby already. "Hello in there," he said softly. "I am your pa, and I promise I will do everything I can to be a good one." Eleanor ran her fingers through his hair, her heart so full she thought it might burst. The pregnancy was not easy. Eleanor was sick for the first few months, barely able to keep food down. Frank worried constantly, bringing her broth and crackers, holding her hair back when she was ill. But by April, the sickness passed and Eleanor bloomed. She glowed with health, her belly swelling, and she worked alongside Frank in the garden, planting vegetables and herbs. They talked endlessly about the baby, about names and futures and all the possibilities. Frank built a cradle from oak, carving it with intricate designs of horses and wildflowers. Eleanor sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands creating magic from cloth. In late August, 2 weeks before Eleanor's due date, a terrible storm rolled across the prairie. The sky turned green and the wind howled like a living thing. Frank rushed to secure the horses while Eleanor battened down the house, and they barely made it inside before the storm hit in full fury. Rain lashed the windows and the house shook on its foundations. Frank held Eleanor close, both of them praying the roof would hold. And then, in the midst of the storm's fury, Eleanor felt the first contraction. "Frank," she gasped, "the baby is coming." Fear flickered across Frank's face, but he tamped it down. "All right, what do you need? Boil water. Get the towels I set aside. And you may need to ride for the doctor if this goes on too long." "I am not leaving you," Frank said firmly. "We will do this together." The labor lasted through the night, with the storm raging outside and Eleanor fighting her own battle within. Frank stayed by her side, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement. Just before dawn, as the storm finally broke and the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, Eleanor gave one final push, and their son entered the world. The baby's cry was strong and healthy, and Frank laughed and sobbed simultaneously as he cut the cord and wrapped his son in a clean blanket. He laid the baby in Eleanor's arms, and they stared down at the tiny, perfect face in wonder. "He is beautiful," Frank whispered. "He looks like you," Eleanor said, tracing the baby's features with one finger. "What should we name him?" Eleanor had been thinking about this. "Frederick," she said. "Frederick James Morrison, for you and for my first husband, so he will carry both loves with him." Frank's eyes filled with tears. "That is perfect. Thank you for honoring James that way. He was part of my life, part of who I am," Eleanor said. "I will never forget him, but I am so grateful to have found you, Frank. You gave me hope when I thought I had none left." Frank kissed her gently. "You gave me purpose. You made me want to build something lasting, something good." Little Frederick James Morrison proved to be a healthy, happy baby. He had Frank's gray-blue eyes and Eleanor's determination, and he quickly became the center of their world. Frank doted on his son, carrying him around the ranch in a sling Eleanor made, talking to him constantly about horses and land and dreams. The ranch prospered. Word spread about Frank Morrison's skill with horses, and buyers came from as far as Dodge City and Abilene to purchase his stock. Eleanor kept the books and managed the household, and when Frederick was old enough, she strapped him to her back and worked in the garden, teaching him about growing things even before he could talk. 2 years after Frederick's birth, Eleanor became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and in the spring of 1876, they welcomed a daughter they named Elizabeth Grace. She had Eleanor's dark hair and Frank's easy smile, and Frederick was instantly smitten with his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. Life fell into a rhythm. The ranch continued to grow, and Frank hired 2 permanent hands to help with the work. He built additions onto the house, expanding it to accommodate their growing family. Eleanor's garden became legendary in the county, providing not only for their family but extras to sell in town. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Frank took Eleanor back to the cemetery where they had first met. James's grave was still there, the coneflowers still blooming purple every summer. Eleanor knelt and placed fresh flowers, saying a quiet prayer of thanks. "I never wanted you to forget him," Frank said, standing beside her. "I never have," Eleanor replied, standing and taking his hand. "But Frank, you taught me something important. You taught me that the heart is not a finite thing. Loving you does not diminish what I felt for James. It just means my heart grew bigger." They walked hand in hand back through the cemetery, past Frank's mother's grave with its bright marigolds, past the markers of all the people who had lived and loved and died. At the gate, Frank paused. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Marrying me so soon after James died. I know people talked." "Never," Eleanor said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me back my life, Frank. You planted hope in my heart when it was buried in grief." Frank pulled her close, kissing her temple. "I love you, Eleanor Morrison." "I love you too." They rode back to the ranch together, racing across the open prairie with laughter on their lips. At home, Frederick and Elizabeth were waiting with the hired hands, and the family gathered around the table for supper, passing bowls and swapping stories and filling the house with warmth. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Frank and Eleanor sat on their porch and watched the stars wheel overhead. The creek sang its eternal song, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its mate. "What are you thinking?" Frank asked, his arm around Eleanor's shoulders. "I am thinking about that day in the cemetery," Eleanor said. "How I was planting flowers on a grave, thinking my life was over. And then this stranger appeared and showed me kindness, and everything changed. I am grateful every day that I decided to visit my mother's grave that afternoon," Frank said. "I almost did not. I almost just rode on through town." "But you did not," Eleanor said. "You stayed, you saw me, you gave me hope." "We gave each other hope," Frank corrected. "I was drifting before I met you, Eleanor. I had money and dreams but no real purpose. You gave me something to build for, someone to become." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds, feeling the future stretch out before them full of promise. Frederick would grow up to be a fine horseman, eventually taking over the ranch and expanding it further. Elizabeth would surprise them all by becoming a teacher, bringing education to ranch children across the county. There would be hard times ahead, years of drought and economic panic, but Frank and Eleanor would weather them together, their love a constant anchor. But they did not know any of that yet. On that October night in 1877, they only knew they had each other. They had their children. They had their land and their dreams. They had taken grief and loss and transformed it into something beautiful, something lasting. Eleanor thought about the widow she had been, kneeling in the dust with tears on her face, planting flowers for the dead. She thought about the cowboy who had stopped to offer kindness and water, who had seen past her grief to the woman beneath. And she thought about how love could come twice if you were brave enough to accept it, how hearts could heal if you let them, how hope could take root even in the most barren soil. "Shall we go to bed?" Frank asked softly. "In a moment," Eleanor said. "I want to stay out here just a little longer. The night is so beautiful." Frank tightened his arm around her, and they stayed like that, wrapped in each other in the darkness, listening to the music of the prairie. Above them, the stars blazed in their courses, indifferent and eternal. But here, on this small ranch in the heart of Kansas, two people who had found each other against all odds sat together in perfect contentment, knowing they were exactly where they belonged. As the years passed, the ranch became one of the most respected in the region. Frank's reputation as a horseman grew, and people came from 3 states away to buy his stock. He developed a particular talent for breeding horses with excellent temperaments, patient and intelligent animals that were equally suited for ranch work or family use. Eleanor's contribution was equally important. Her business acumen and careful record-keeping ensuring the ranch remained profitable even in lean years. Frederick grew into a tall, serious boy who loved the land as much as his father did. From the time he could walk, he followed Frank around the ranch, absorbing everything like a sponge. Frank was a patient teacher, showing his son how to read a horse's mood, how to approach a skittish animal, how to gentle rather than break. Eleanor would watch them from the porch sometimes, her heart swelling with love at the sight of the dark head and the small one bent together over some task. Elizabeth was different, bright and curious, and always asking questions. She learned her letters early, devouring every book that came into the house. Eleanor saw something of herself in her daughter, that same hunger for knowledge, for understanding the world beyond the immediate horizon. When Elizabeth announced at age 10 that she wanted to be a teacher, Eleanor supported her completely, even when some of the neighboring ranchers scoffed at the idea of educating a girl beyond basic literacy. The Morrison Ranch became known for more than just horses. Eleanor's garden expanded year by year until it was nearly an acre, producing vegetables and herbs that she sold in town. She also began a small side business preserving fruits and making jams, her products sought after throughout the county. The money she earned went into a special fund for the children's education, ensuring they would have opportunities beyond the ranch if they wanted them. In 1880, when Frederick was 7 and Elizabeth 5, Eleanor became pregnant again, unexpectedly. She was 31 now, and the pregnancy was harder than the first two had been. She spent the last months on bed rest, with Frank hovering anxiously and the children trying to be helpful. In December, she gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Daniel and Samuel. The twins were a handful from the beginning, identical in appearance but opposite in temperament. Daniel was quiet and thoughtful, while Samuel was bold and mischievous. They kept the household in chaos and laughter in equal measure. Frank hired a woman from town to help Eleanor with the housework. Knowing 4 children under 8 was more than one person could manage alone, through it all, Frank and Eleanor's love deepened and matured. They had moved past the passionate intensity of early romance into something richer and more complex. They knew each other's moods and quirks, could communicate with a glance across a crowded room, had learned to navigate disagreements with respect and compromise. They still made time for each other, stealing moments alone when they could, maintaining the romance even amidst the chaos of family life. Every year on their anniversary, they would take a day for themselves, riding out to the spot by the creek where Frank had first proposed. They would spread a blanket and share a picnic, talking about the year past and the year ahead, reconnecting without the demands of children and ranch and daily life. These days became sacred to them, a tradition they maintained for decades. In 1882, tragedy struck when a wildfire swept across the prairie in late summer. Frank and the ranch hands worked frantically to create fire breaks and wet down the buildings. Eleanor helped, despite Frank's protests, hauling water and beating out spot fires. The children were sent into town for safety, and for 2 terrifying days the Morrison Ranch fought for its survival. In the end, they lost the barn and several outbuildings, but the house and most of the corrals survived. All the horses were saved, though it had been a near thing getting them evacuated in time. Frank stood in the ashes of his barn and wept, not from loss but from relief that his family was safe. "We will rebuild," Eleanor said, her face streaked with soot and sweat, her hands blistered from fighting the fire. "We have done it before and we will do it again." And they did. The neighboring ranchers came together, as was the way in those times, and in a massive barn raising that lasted 3 days, They constructed a new barn bigger and better than the old one. Frank was humbled by the outpouring of support, and he made sure to pay it forward in later years when others faced disaster. The fire had one unexpected benefit. It cleared away years of accumulated brush and deadfall, and the following spring, wildflowers bloomed across the ranch in profusion. Eleanor walked through drifts of purple coneflowers, the same kind she had planted on James's grave all those years ago, and felt like it was a sign, the universe's way of showing that beauty could emerge from destruction. Frederick turned 16 in 1885, and Frank began teaching him the intricacies of running the ranch. The boy had a good head for business and his mother's attention to detail. He started taking over more responsibilities, freeing up Frank's time for the breeding program he had been wanting to develop. Eleanor watched her firstborn becoming a man and felt a bittersweet pride. Time moved so quickly. Elizabeth, at 13, was preparing to go away to school. There was a women's academy in Kansas City that offered teacher training, and Eleanor and Frank had saved enough to send her. The day they put her on the train was one of the hardest of Eleanor's life. She clung to her daughter, memorizing the feel of her, knowing she would come back changed. "I am so proud of you," Eleanor whispered. "I will make you proud," Elizabeth promised, and she did. She excelled at the academy, finishing at the top of her class, and returned to Kansas at 18 with a teaching certificate and determination to make a difference. The twins, meanwhile, were growing into their own persons. Daniel showed an interest in medicine, poring over medical texts that Eleanor ordered for him. Samuel loved working with his hands, building things, creating. Frank encouraged both boys, knowing the ranch could not support all 4 children, that they would need to find their own paths. In 1888, Frederick married a girl from a neighboring ranch, a sweet-natured young woman named Mary who loved horses nearly as much as he did. They had a small ceremony at the ranch, and Eleanor cried happy tears as she watched her son pledge his life to another. Frank stood beside her, his hand in hers, and she knew he was thinking the same thing. Their children were creating their own futures, their own families, and it was exactly as it should be. Frederick and Mary built a small house on the far corner of the ranch property, close enough to help with the work but far enough for privacy. A year later, they made Frank and Eleanor grandparents with the birth of a daughter. Eleanor held her granddaughter and marveled at the circle of life, at how she had gone from grieving widow to wife to mother to grandmother. Elizabeth took a teaching position in Ellsworth, boarding with a family in town during the week and coming home on weekends. She threw herself into her work, teaching children from ranches and farms all around the county. Eleanor would see the exhaustion on her daughter's face, but also the satisfaction, the joy of knowing she was making a difference. In 1890, Daniel left for medical school in St. Louis. His tuition paid from Eleanor's preserve fund and loans they secured based on the ranch's reputation. It was hard to see another child leave, but Eleanor was fiercely proud of his ambition. Samuel, at 17, was apprenticing with a carpenter in town, learning the trade and proving to have real talent. Frank turned 45 that year, and Eleanor 41. They were no longer young, but they were healthy and happy and surrounded by family. The ranch was prosperous, their children were thriving, and they still loved each other with an intensity that had only grown over the years. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Frank said, "Do you remember what you told me once about your heart growing bigger?" "I remember," Eleanor said. "I have been thinking about that," Frank said. "About how loving more people does not divide the love but multiplies it. I see it now with our children and our grandchildren. Each new person just makes there be more love in the world." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. "We have been blessed, Frank." "We have made our blessings," Frank corrected gently. "We chose this, Eleanor. We chose to love, to build, to create a family and a legacy. None of it was given to us. We worked for it." "That is true," Eleanor agreed. "And I would choose it all again, every moment." They sat in the gathering darkness, comfortable in their silence, until the first stars appeared and Eleanor shivered slightly in the evening chill. Frank stood and offered his hand. "Come to bed, my love." "I am coming," Eleanor said, taking his hand and letting him pull her up. They walked into their house, into the home they had built together, and closed the door against the night. The years continued to roll past, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. Elizabeth married one of the other teachers from town, a kind man named Thomas who shared her passion for education. They started a small school specifically for ranch children, traveling a circuit so that even the most remote families could access education. Eleanor helped fund the venture, proud beyond measure of what her daughter was accomplishing. Daniel completed medical school and returned to Kansas to practice, setting up a clinic in Ellsworth. He became known for his willingness to ride out to ranches in emergencies, often refusing payment from families who could not afford it. Frank and Eleanor helped subsidize his practice in the early years, knowing he was doing important work. Samuel married young and moved to Topeka, where his carpentry skills were in high demand as the city grew. He built beautiful furniture and houses, making a name for himself as a craftsman. He and his wife had 5 children, and they would visit the ranch every summer, filling the house with noise and laughter. Frederick took over more and more of the ranch operations as Frank's arthritis worsened in his knees and hands. It was hard for Frank to step back, to let his son make decisions, but Eleanor helped him see that it was the natural order of things. They had built this place so it would outlast them, so their children and grandchildren would have a foundation. Frederick was proving himself more than capable. In 1895, Eleanor turned 46 and Frank 50. They had been married 22 years, and Eleanor could hardly remember the grieving widow she had been. That woman felt like someone from another lifetime, someone she had read about in a book. Her life with Frank was so full, so rich, that sometimes she forgot there had been anything before. But she never completely forgot James. She still visited his grave occasionally, usually alone, bringing flowers and having quiet conversations with the memory of the boy she had married. The guilt she had felt in the early days of loving Frank was long gone, replaced by a gentle nostalgia and gratitude that she had been able to love twice, to have 2 good men in her life. One day, while visiting the cemetery, Eleanor found Frank there as well, standing at his mother's grave. They had not planned to come together, but Eleanor was not surprised. Some part of them would always be drawn back to this place where they had met. "Hello, my love," Frank said, coming to stand beside her at James's grave. "Hello," Eleanor replied, leaning into him. "I was just telling James about our grandchildren. I think he would have liked knowing his namesake became a doctor." "I am sure he would," Frank said. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I used to be jealous of him, you know, in the early days." Eleanor looked up in surprise. "Jealous? Of what? Of being your first love, of having that piece of you I could never touch." Frank smiled ruefully. "I was young and foolish." "You were never foolish," Eleanor said firmly. "And Frank, being first does not mean being best. What we have, what we built together, it is deeper than anything I could have imagined at 19. "I know that now," Frank said. He gestured to the grave. "Thank you, James Campbell, for loving her first, for teaching her what a good man looks like. I like to think I have been worthy of the gift." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "You have been more than worthy. You have been everything." They stood together in the quiet cemetery, honoring the past while being fully present in their current love. Then, hand in hand, they walked back to their horses and rode home together. The turn of the century brought changes to the entire country, and the Morrison Ranch was not immune. The wild frontier of their youth was being tamed, fenced, civilized. The great cattle drives were ending as railroads crisscrossed the plains. Towns were growing into cities. The world was modernizing, and Eleanor and Frank were growing older. By 1900, Frank was 55 and Eleanor 51. Frederick was running the ranch with his two oldest sons, Frederick Jr. and James. Eleanor spent most of her time with her garden and her grandchildren, of which there were now 11. She and Frank had slowed down, content to let the younger generation take the lead. They celebrated their 27th anniversary quietly, just the two of them riding out to their special spot by the creek. Frank's knees protested the ride, and Eleanor's back ached, but they made it. They spread their blanket in the same spot where Frank had proposed all those years ago. 27 years, Frank mused, lying back and looking at the sky through the cottonwood leaves. Where did the time go? Into 4 children, 11 grandchildren, a successful ranch, and a lifetime of love, Eleanor said, lying beside him and taking his hand. I would say we spent it well. No regrets, not a single one. Only that I did not meet you sooner, Frank said, but then I suppose we met exactly when we were meant to. In a cemetery, Eleanor said with a laugh. Most women meet their husbands at socials or church, but not me. You were never most women, Frank said, rolling onto his side to look at her. You were always extraordinary. Even after nearly 3 decades together, Eleanor still felt her heart flutter when Frank looked at her like that. I love you, Frank Morrison. I love you too, Eleanor Morrison. And I will love you until my last breath and beyond. They kissed, slow and sweet, two people who knew each other's bodies and hearts intimately. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor rested her head on Frank's chest, listening to his heartbeat steady and sure. What do you think happens after? She asked quietly. After we die. Frank was silent for a moment, his hand stroking her hair. I think we go on somehow. I like to imagine a place where all the people we have loved are waiting, where your James and my mother are together, watching over us. And someday, when our time comes, we will join them and there will be no jealousy or pain, only love. That sounds nice, Eleanor said. I hope you are right. Even if I am not, we will face it together, Frank said. Just like we have faced everything else. They stayed by the creek until the sun began to set, talking and dreaming and remembering. Then they rode slowly back to the ranch, to the house they had built, to the family they had created, to the life they had chosen. The new century brought new challenges. In 1905, a drought struck the region, the worst in living memory. The creek on the Morrison Ranch slowed to a trickle, and the grass turned brown and brittle. Frank and Frederick worked desperately to keep the horses watered and fed, hauling water from town when necessary, buying hay at exorbitant prices. It was the hardest year the ranch had ever faced. Eleanor watched her husband age 10 years in that 1 year of drought. The constant worry, the physical strain of the work, took a toll on Frank's health. His hair went completely gray, and he developed a persistent cough that worried Eleanor deeply. She convinced him to see Daniel, who examined his father and prescribed rest. Rest, Frank scoffed. How can I rest when the ranch is dying? The ranch will survive, Eleanor said firmly. But I need you to survive too. Please, Frank, for me. So Frank stepped back, letting Frederick handle the day-to-day operations. It galled him to be sidelined, but Eleanor kept him busy with other tasks, lighter work that would not strain him. They spent more time together that year than they had in ages, and Eleanor found she treasured it, even amidst the drought's hardship. The rains finally came in the spring of 1906, and the prairie bloomed in celebration. The Morrison ranch had survived, leaner but intact. Frank's health improved with the better weather, though he never regained the vigor of his youth. He was 61 now, and finally accepting that he was getting old. In 1907, Elizabeth and Thomas opened a permanent school in Ellsworth, a beautiful building funded partially by donations from the Morrison family and other local ranchers. At the dedication ceremony, Eleanor stood beside Frank and watched their daughter give a speech about the importance of education, and she felt pride so fierce it was almost painful. "We did that," Frank whispered to her. "We raised that remarkable woman." "We did," Eleanor agreed. Daniel's practice was thriving, and he had taken on a younger doctor as a partner. Samuel's carpentry business had expanded to 3 locations across Kansas. Frederick's oldest son was talking about starting his own horse breeding operation. The Morrison legacy was spreading, growing, touching more lives than Eleanor had ever imagined. In the fall of 1910, Frank suffered a minor heart episode while working with a young horse. He survived, but it frightened them both deeply. Daniel was blunt with his parents. Frank's heart was weakening, and he needed to take it easy or risk a major attack that could kill him. This time, Frank did not argue. He fully retired, handing over the ranch operations completely to Frederick. It was bittersweet but also freeing. For the first time in 40 years, Frank did not have daily responsibilities weighing on him. He and Eleanor settled into a peaceful routine, tending her garden, playing with their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. They celebrated their 37th anniversary in 1912, once again at their spot by the creek. Frank could no longer ride, so Frederick drove them in a wagon. They spread their blanket and sat together, watching the water flow past. 37 years, Eleanor said softly. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes like no time at all." "I know what you mean," Frank said. His hair was white now, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were still that same gray-blue that had captured Eleanor's heart in a cemetery so long ago. "Eleanor, if I could go back and do it all again, I would not change a thing. Every joy, every sorrow, every moment with you has been a gift." "Even the hard parts?" Eleanor asked. "Especially the hard parts," Frank said, "because we faced them together and they made us stronger." Eleanor leaned into him, and they sat in comfortable silence. 2 old people who had loved each other well and been loved in return. The creek sang its song, the cottonwoods rustled overhead, and the world turned on its axis, indifferent to the small miracles of human love. But Frank and Eleanor knew. They knew how rare it was, how precious, to find someone who saw you completely and loved you anyway. They knew how fortunate they were to have built a life together, to have created a family, to have turned grief and loss into hope and love. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Frank took Eleanor's hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what? For letting me love you, for choosing hope, for building this beautiful life with me." Eleanor lifted his hand to her lips and kissed it gently. "Thank you for seeing me that day, for offering kindness to a stranger, for planting hope in my heart when I thought it was dead." They stayed until the stars came out, until Frederick came looking for them, worried about his elderly parents in the gathering dark. They let him help them into the wagon, and they rode back to the ranch slowly, savoring every moment. Frank lived for 3 more years, years filled with love and laughter and the comfort of family. In the spring of 1915, he suffered a massive heart attack while sitting on the porch, watching Eleanor work in her garden. He died before Daniel could arrive, but Eleanor was with him, holding his hand, telling him she loved him. The funeral was huge, with people coming from all over Kansas to pay their respects to Frank Morrison, a man who had been known for his integrity, his skill with horses, and his devotion to his family. Eleanor stood dry-eyed through the ceremony, accepting condolences with grace, and then she requested some time alone at the grave. She knelt in the dirt, not caring about her black dress, and placed wildflowers on the fresh earth. "I will see you soon, my love," she whispered. "But I am not quite ready yet. There are still things I need to do here." True to her word, Eleanor lived for another 10 years. She stayed on the ranch, now run by Frederick and his sons, and she became the family matriarch, the keeper of stories and memories. She told her grandchildren and great-grandchildren about their grandfather, about the man who had offered water to a grieving widow and changed both their lives forever. She never remarried. Many people suggested it, but Eleanor had no interest. She had been blessed with 2 good men in her life, and that was enough. She spent her remaining years tending her garden, which had become a showplace, and writing down the family history so it would not be lost. In 1925, at the age of 76, Eleanor Campbell Morrison died peacefully in her sleep. Her children and grandchildren gathered for the funeral, filling the church to overflowing. They buried her beside Frank in the cemetery where they had met 53 years earlier. Frederick, now an old man himself, stood between the graves of his parents and spoke. "My mother used to tell me that the heart is not a finite thing, that loving more people just makes it grow bigger. She lived that truth every day of her life. She loved my father James, who I was named for, even though I never knew him. She loved my father Frank with everything she had. She loved all of us, her children and grandchildren, without reservation. And she taught us that grief can be transformed into hope, that endings can become beginnings, that love is always worth the risk." He placed purple coneflowers on both graves, the same flowers Eleanor had planted on James's grave all those years ago, the same flowers that bloomed wild across the ranch every spring. Then the family gathered for a meal at the ranch house, sharing stories and memories, celebrating a life well lived and a love that had transcended death not once but twice. Years later, when the old stories were told around family gatherings, someone would always ask how Frank and Eleanor met. And whoever was telling would smile and say, "In a cemetery, can you believe it? She was planting flowers on a grave and he offered her water." And from that simple kindness, from that moment of connection between 2 strangers, came all of this. The ranch, our family, the legacy we still carry. He planted hope in her heart when she thought she would never feel anything but grief again, and she gave him purpose and direction, and a reason to build something lasting. They saved each other, really. And they showed us all what love can do when you are brave enough to accept it, even in the most unlikely places. And the younger generations would listen in wonder, trying to imagine a time before the ranch, before the family, when their great-grandmother and great-grandfather were just 2 lonely people who found each other against all odds and chose to build a life together. They would look at the old photographs, at Eleanor's serious face and Frank's kind eyes, and they would understand that they were the product of hope, of courage, of love that refused to give up. The Morrison Ranch continued for generations, passing from father to son, adapting to changing times but always maintaining the values Frank and Eleanor had instilled: hard work, integrity, love of the land, and devotion to family. And every spring, when the purple coneflowers bloomed wild across the prairie, someone would remember the story of the widow planting flowers on a grave and the cowboy who stopped to offer kindness, and how from that simple act of compassion grew a love story for the ages. In the cemetery in Ellsworth, Kansas, 3 graves stood together under the cottonwood trees. James Campbell's marker was weathered now, the dates barely legible. 1848, 1872. Beside it, Frank and Eleanor Morrison lay side by side, their stones reading. Frank Morrison, 1845–1915, beloved husband and father, and Eleanor Campbell Morrison, 1849–1925, beloved wife and mother. Purple coneflowers grew between the graves, blooming every year without fail. A living reminder that love could grow even in the soil of grief, that hope could take root in the darkest places, that the human heart was capable of more than we ever imagined. And if you listened carefully on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the grass and the last light faded from the sky, you might almost hear the echo of two voices talking softly, sharing stories, laughing together, as they had done for 37 years of marriage and beyond. Because some loves are strong enough to transcend time and death, to become part of the very land itself, to echo through generations, reminding us all that hope and healing and happiness are always possible, if we are brave enough to accept the kindness of strangers and wise enough to let our hearts grow bigger instead of smaller in the face of loss. The Morrison family still gathers at the ranch every summer, now 5 and 6 generations removed from Frank and Eleanor, and they still tell the story of their ancestors who met in a cemetery and built a legacy of love. They walk through Eleanor's garden, now maintained by whoever currently lives in the old house, and they marvel at how some of the plants are descended from the originals she planted over 150 years ago. They ride horses descended from Frank's breeding stock, and they sleep in rooms of the house he built with his own hands. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, the current generation swears they can smell wildflowers when there are none nearby, or hear the creak of the porch swing moving when there is no wind. They like to think it is Frank and Eleanor, still together, still watching over the family they created, still proving that love is the most powerful force in the universe, capable of transforming grief into joy, strangers into soulmates, and simple acts of kindness into legacies that last forever.